we're now moving into the era of question and answer. So I would invite you to come to the microphone if you would. Please state your name and have at it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tam Voynick. I was wondering, we've heard a lot about the challenges in West Texas, and that legislators from East Texas are not as interested in water problems. And Ron Ellis, the map that you showed with locations that are at risk of not having more than 180 days of water resources showed a fair number of locations in East Texas. So I was wondering whether those were just sort of random outliers or whether there are some challenges in East Texas that you could tell us about.
Well, is this on? The problems that those systems face come from a variety of reasons. You know, some of those are on groundwater, and you know, either their pump has burned out because the groundwater level is lower than it had been. One of the systems that in East Texas that we worked really hard on, worked with extensively, is a system that takes water from Toledo Bend Reservoir, but it takes water from an arm of the reservoir, and the reservoir level had dropped to the degree that that arm of the reservoir didn't have you know, sufficient water level for their pumping. So you know, stream flow and you know, surface water resources is one, you know, factor that that could lead a system to be on that list, but you know, the variety of reasons that a system could end up on that list apply statewide in drought.
I'm Richard Earl from Texas State University. I have a question for Cindy. Did the 2011 drought result in any cessation of water permits to protect critical habitat of whooping cranes?
No, not that I'm aware of.
What's the status of the Sierra Club suit on that matter?
As I understand it, the federal judge in the case will be issuing her ruling. Todd is probably more
well, before the
Sierra
Club has faints, they're not part of that suit.
Oh, I'm sorry,
so
not the Sierra Club. Whooping crane.
Yeah, the lawsuit is in the judge's hands now, and she's said a couple times she's going to rule sometime around the end of the summer, but she could rule anytime at this point.
You know, if I could follow on to that question, because we haven't really touched upon the Edwards Aquifer Recovery Implementation Plan, and I think it's critically important that we do for a moment. I'm curious, Dr. Robert Goley did what is a remarkable job in bringing stakeholders from across the area together to actually do what I think is a landmark approach toward improving an approach toward water and water management overall. I'm curious, are there things that we should be learning from that process that can really have significant impacts on, again, assuring adequate, sustainable water supply to meet demands across the entire state? And I'd like to ask each of the panelists, or at least several of them, to comment on that.
I'll go ahead and go. Can you hear me? So I was the Parks and Wildlife member on the Edwards Aquifer Recovery Implementation Program, the ERIP. And I agree, Robert Goley did an amazing job. You know, there aren't many folks out there that had the background knowing the ins and outs of the Endangered Species Act, also knowing you know, some of our issues in that region. But I think the willingness of all the different stakeholders to come together. So one, it was truly a stakeholder process, an open and transparent stakeholder process, and it was driven by the science. So there are a number of things there that, you know, maybe it takes 20 years, you know, after the Sierra Club does see Fish and Wildlife Service to get to the point where you have all those conditions come together. I hope that that's not what it takes for some other parts of the state to be able to, you know, reach those lasting solutions. Todd was also part of the process.
I was on the steering committee with Cindy, and I'll just say this. That's a case of the right person at the right place at the right time with some additional help, which included the legislature putting some deadlines on everybody. You know, most of the time, these recovery implementation programs under federal law have no time limit, and so some of them take 10+ years. This one took 4 years. essentially, and was still a lot of work. But at the very end, this last year, the whole process almost fell apart. Most people don't know this, but we got
Several times.
the people on the steering committee know, and it almost fell apart because of the issue of who pays. And you know, one of the things that was a major factor in keeping it from falling apart was the ongoing drought, and the fear of having that process fall apart during the drought was overwhelming. And so, you know, drought's a bad thing, but you know, in that situation, it helped to keep things from falling apart at a critical time.
So Ron or Karen, would you have any insights into that?
I'm just gonna add that there is a lot going on in the environmental flow world right now. Senate Bill 3 was passed several years ago, and each river basin now is going through a process to determine what is the appropriate amount of environmental flow to be dedicated from water supplies available. So our basin is just wrapping up. We achieved consensus among all the different stakeholders. This is one of these grassroots, you know, from the floor up, sort of like the state water plan. And LCRA does dedicate water for environment. We do reserve water that can be made available, especially in times when there is not other water available. But not all water rights, you know, are required to dedicate water to the environment. So this process sets up goals that hopefully strategies can be developed to achieve those goals going forward.
I'll confess, I really don't have the background.
That's fine, that's fine. Next question, please.
Yes, my name is Jordan Fernandes. I'm with Interra, and I have a question for Ron Ellis. Relating to the priority calls that were made last year, how does TCQ decide, say they receive a priority call, how do they decide whether a water right holder has a junior right to that call or whether they're a senior water right holder? That's my basic question.
Well, we look at all of the water rights that are in the geographic area, you know, the junior rights that are upstream of a senior water right making a call. And basically, it's based on priority date. You know, senior and junior are relative to each other. So we look at, we try to identify the least number of water rights, junior water rights, that can be impacted to have to make water available to the senior water right that can be beneficially used by that senior water right. There were some calls that we received in 2011 where we determined that curtailing or suspending all of the water rights in the upstream watershed would not result in any water getting to the senior water right holder that they could beneficially use. And in those instances, we did not suspend water rights.
Do you have a methodology that you could explain for how you make those determinations?
Well, we look at the existing, I mean, I can give you a high-level answer to that. I mean, we look at the existing water rights upstream. You know, we look at the diversion rates that they're authorized. We look at past water use reports to try to identify, you know, who may or may not be using water upstream. And you know, we use the best available information we have to make our best guess at this point as to what could arrive at the senior water rights location.
Thank you.
So I've been told I stand between, or we stand between lunch and the next session, but I'd like to have at least one more question if I could.
Well, if I might, I'd like to ask Parks and Wildlife if you have any studies on the 180-degree opposite of the need for storage or conservation, and should we be so fortunate as to have a lot of rains and back to the incidents of flooding that where the flood control and storage component of our reservoirs were created, as far as the salinity balance, the limited information that I've seen says that that's sort of a tipping point, and while the excess salinity, absent freshwater inflows, is harmful, a great surge of fresh water undoing the salinity balance in the opposite direction, I've been told can have an opposite effect. And I wonder if you studied that, and if so, what the status of those considerations are.
So if I understand the question, it's having a drastic freshening in the bay systems?
Right.
Versus
If
on
you
the
get tremendous flooding, outflow,
Right.
flushing into the bay and estuary systems, contrasted with the need for storage some of that water to avoid the flushing.
Well, I'm not aware of any studies that address that issue in particular. You know, we do have flood storage reservoirs, and of course, when you know, flooding's happening, we need to protect the property and life downstream, and so the flood control reservoirs serve that function. You know, there have been instances of freshwater impacts to our estuaries if the freshwater happens at a time during different species life cycles that can be detrimental. But I think to answer your question directly, we don't have a study that I'm aware of that looks specifically at that issue.
Well, I guess the reason I ask it, in some of our basins, there's a relatively large watershed downstream from the last flood control reservoir. And when we get a big coastal rain, we've gotten these flushing incidents that have resulted in fish kills by upsetting the salinity balance in the opposite direction. So there may be a win-win equation that deserves a look there to see, in addition to additional water supply and storage for the periods when we're water shy, additional flood control storage in those parts of the weather cycle when we get significant flooding in the coastal region and have unprotected watershed downstream.
Thank you for that question, and let me just wrap up. I at least a few takeaways. Firstly, I heard that drought was good. Life as a fish is really, really tough. And the third takeaway is, let me thank our panelists one more time for an excellent session.
I want to add my thanks to the panel as well, and also to Lest for moderating that session. We now have lunch on Salon C. We're going to be starting at